Okay, everybody, I'd like to get your attention for a minute because now we're going to be starting the panel to talk about technoskepticism between possibility and refusal. So thank you all for being here to celebrate the launch of this book. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to do a land acknowledgement first. This event is taking place on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi, as well as the Wyandot. And as we live here and learn here, we honor the indigenous people who continue to steward this land and those who are forcibly removed from it. We also have an accessibility statement. The Disco Network is committed to accessibility and digital equity, and as such, we invite audience members to experience the event in whatever way brings you the most comfort. Cart captioning is available and may be accessed via the show captions option in Zoom. So the Disco Network is a national network of researchers, artists, technologists, policymakers, and practitioners that challenge digital, social, and racial inequalities. We integrate critical humanistic, social science, and artistic approaches to digital studies and foreground questions about the cultural implications of technology to envision a new anti-racist and anti-ableist digital future. Disco is generously funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. So we have a few events coming up that I would like to bring to your attention. One of them is a panel on TikTok, DeepSeek, and the fear of Chinese tech in nationalist times. And we have some exciting guests scheduled for that. We have another one, April 14th, called Building the Indigenous Internet, which will feature indigenous scholars, people who are building and have built indigenous networks, often in homelands. So please come to those. So here's the book, and here's the kind of précis, which I'm not going to read all of it, because you're going to hear about it from some of the authors in a minute on this panel. Okay. So here are the co-authors. This looks nuts. I completely agree, but everybody on this slide equally participated in the writing of this book and looked at every single part of it at least once. So this miracle was made possible, again, by the funding from Mellon and also the work of our book sprints facilitator, Barbara Rulig, who is not on this panel, but in many ways I wish she were. I mean, she was completely the reason we were able to write a quite long scholarly book for an academic press and get it out in 4 days. The panelists are Rayvon, Fouché. I will wait till, actually, can everybody come up so I can introduce you with your face, actually? We have 5 authors who shared the experience of writing this book, which covers issues around digital diagnosis, nostalgia for earlier platforms, and also blackness and AI. So we have Rayvon Fouché, right there. Huan, who is also there. Rianna, Walcott. Lida, Zeitlin-Wu, and Remi, Yergeau. And we have 2 interlocutors who are Oliver Haimson and Wells, Luke Santo, who are going to sit here. And we'll have a dialogue with the panelists. They have prepared some questions, which I think are excellent. So let me just hand it over. So here's question 1. I will just hang around here in case I need to. And yeah, would you like to start with posing one of these?
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the introduction, and really exciting to be here. I really enjoyed reading the book, so congratulations to all of you. First of all, can we just have a round of applause for the authors? So our first question is a multi-part question from both Wells and myself. And we were thinking about the way that you're presenting technoskepticism in the book as this position somewhere between possibility and refusal. And so if we're thinking about attitudes towards technology as the spectrum, going from possibility on one end to refusal on another, And we were wondering to what extent you are seeing skepticism as sitting squarely in the middle, or do you feel that it leans closer to one end or the other? And that's just part of the question.
Yeah, and Oliver and I were discussing this book earlier this week, and for us, technoskepticism, when we first came into it, we thought, oh, this is probably going to be closer to refusal, but when we encountered it in the book, it felt a lot closer to the side of possibility. And given that all of you probably lie different parts on the spectrum, where do each of you personally find yourself on it? Or as a spoiler for some of the chapters, do you completely just reject that dichotomy?
Hello, hi. So for me, I think I'd place I think part of it is about being able to move between those two positions. So in the chapter about playing with ChatGPT, it was very much about like engaging as a form of both of those things. I think that, you know, amongst us, even as we were writing it together, there were you know, these often like fierce sort of battles between who uses it in what way and why and in what, under what circumstances. I don't think it's a case of like being able to say that you outwardly like refuse all aspects of it or under all circumstances. I think for myself, I have this like quite visceral disgust when it comes towards ChatGPT and generative AIs, because, you know, just because I'm a hater. But I also, like, I'm finding myself thinking about like, well, if it's here, how do I engage with it in a way that, you know, if it's here and I have to negotiate people, or, you know, like even in my teaching or whatever, if I have to negotiate people using it in such a way, how can I do this from a perspective that means that I don't lose the things that I do like about education and teaching and learning and, you know, and creativity and, you know, human engagement in that way. So I think that what skepticism does for me is it allows us to sort of use it but remain critical, or you know, in that way, or use it in a way that is in support of your own goals or whatever you want. So it's, yeah, it's a constantly shifting thing. It's like, what bits of it can I take? What bits of it do I need to leave behind? And it kind of clarifies what I feel about every little part of it, clarifies what I care about.
Like kind of a co-optation to some
Yeah,
extent?
yeah, like pushing back and also making fun of it. Like part of the skeptical bit is like is about the fun, about the play as well. Part of what we've been doing as well, like, and I'm gonna probably talk about this later, is like looking at how different folks are very like cognizant of like the problems with it, and then choose to, and what ways do you choose to engage with it anyway, and then can you like actively make fun of it as you do? So it becomes a co-producer for you. You are still making something, but with a, you know, but with like a clarity about what those conditions are that you're doing it under. That's weirdly vague in a lot of ways.
I guess I'll jump in next. I think I would say, like most things, it's context dependent for me. The place where I feel that I have more agential control, I think I'm probably more optimistic. In places where I feel like things are further from my reach, touch, my experience, that I feel more pessimistic. And I think it vacillates oftentimes, even within the specific techno-scientific context and specific moments, right? We're living I mean, obviously the elephant in the room, we're living in a really fascinating, strange, precarious moment. And I jokingly tell people it would be a very interesting time to study the United States if I didn't live here. And, but it's very, I would think for the work that we're trying to do and supporting, even at the nexus of science, technology, race, difference, disability, gender, sexuality, it's an incredibly precarious moment. So I try to be inherently optimistic, because in these moments of changing landscapes of power and authority, I think you have to be mildly optimistic, because that's, I don't know, as a person who studies black people have been tremendously optimistic in a world that has treated them very poorly. And I think lots of marginalized communities have done the same. But I guess it's I mean, I think for me, like, the book is really playing with that idea. And I think, Rianna, it was really great that you mentioned play, is that you have to laugh at it, because if you don't laugh, it will kind of eat you alive. And so part of for me, the book is really playing with that question of like, how do we negotiate these different ways in which we live in this technologically driven world, but not let the pessimism override our hopes and aspirations for what the tech can bring for us.
Yeah, I'll jump in here too. I've read this book a couple of times with different eyes in terms of being a writer and then editing parts, and then also just more recently trying to take it all in. And I'm surprised at, at least in my latest reading and kind of take, with distance from the actual writing of the book, that there is, I agree, like a lot of kind of possibility. It leans more towards the optimism in a way that I find really exciting when I read it. I mean, I also feel like when I'm noticing like a lot of the playful moments, like I find myself just laughing at certain sections when I'm reading in a way that kind of, I think, we'll talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about the collaborative process of writing. But I feel like one thing, Rianna, you were talking about thinking about technoskepticism as like a tool or how to use it. And I feel like that's perhaps how I think about this term. I'm generally kind of a pessimistic or a critical person, and I find myself perhaps defaulting to a state of pessimism, which can feel a little bit more like claustrophobic in terms of just not really having a lot of room to breathe and think about, like, new relationships to the people around me, the communities I'm involved in, to technology. And I think throughout the book, there is this kind of push to really create like a space, like an expansive, capacious kind of orientation to trying to think about how, Black, Asian, queer, disabled peoples have always tried to creatively carve out space in all of these different stages of digital transition, the internet, and you can kind of mine and locate and identify these different strategies. And I don't know, I just kind of really enjoyed, I guess, seeing all of this come together in my last read, which was probably the first time I sat down and read it from beginning to end. But I would say, yeah, for me, it's more on the possibility side for me, if I can kind of think of technoskepticism as like a tool, I guess. Yeah.
Sure. I think, well, it's interesting to hear one say, now you're on the possibility side. I feel like for me, similarly come from a particular kind of academic training that very much emphasizes the pessimism. The kind of academic background I came from didn't really allow space for that kind of more hopeful side. And so I've been thinking about where it is sort of, some people have used the word critical or criticism, and I think, of course, critical as in critical theory doesn't always mean, this is bad. Often it does end up looking like that. So I don't really have an answer, but thinking about sort of how skepticism maybe also kind of gets around some of these larger conversations in the academy about the place of critique and theory and all that. I think skepticism is maybe more refreshing. It doesn't have to deal with all that. But in terms of the kind of collaborative writing, which we'll talk about, I feel like this process pushed me more towards embracing the kind of possibility side of things. So I feel like it's not to say skepticism is just an averaging out of all the authors' perspectives, but I think there is something where it's talking to some people who are in this room and some who couldn't make it, really opening up my eyes about how to kind of approach these questions of technology. Because I feel like I think a lot of people talk about how this kind of paradigm of resistance doesn't really work in the kind of neoliberal moment we're in, and which is why I really like books like Tung Hui-Hu's Digital Lethargy that are thinking about sort of different ways of engaging that aren't just kind of rise up. And so I feel like maybe skepticism allows for that as well. And then I'm also thinking about the kind of temporality or time frame of all this, thinking about when we wrote this in summer 2023. It's not like it was a super, hopeful political moment or something, but by contrast, it does feel that way. And so I feel the kind of optimism when I reread the book, but as Juan said, I'm also reading it with these kind of new eyes and feeling like, wow, I already feel more pessimistic than I did when we wrote this in ChatGPT, just summer 2023, like already so much has changed. And so I don't know, whatever happens, I think this book will be a kind of interesting time capsule of a particular kind of moment of skepticism and not knowing what's next.
So am I audible now? Awesome, okay. Yeah, I think following what everybody else has said, I'm maybe thinking through this question with a specific example, and that's CART and captions. And so, I mean, we've got CART here right now through Zoom, and then if you're in the room, we've got a screen on display on the other side of the podium. And when we wrote the book together, Lisa had mentioned Barbara as, a co-author who's not named. Angie, our CART provider, was another co-author who wasn't named, and so we had CART throughout the entire week. And I mentioned this in thinking about that relationship between refusal and possibility, in that trying to gain access to CART or any other kind of accommodation, especially a technologized one, is incredibly, incredibly difficult. There's a tremendous amount of labor involved, and especially thinking about the relationship between CART, which is a human provider, versus automated captions or automated transcripts. And the relationship between humans and accuracy and machines gets really complex. Automated captions have gotten quote unquote better, but during the pandemic, University of Michigan was claiming that Zoom's auto caption feature was 99% accurate, and anybody who's ever turned that thing on knows that that is absolutely false. On the other hand, it's in many ways a godsend when you do not have access to CART, because it's something. But also anybody who's had to navigate getting accommodations knows that they are routinely denied. And both CART and automated captions have been claimed by universities to be security risks, because your words are suddenly transcribed, right? This is now a saved file that's entering the universe. Anybody could intercept this. If it's about a tenure case, somebody's dissertation, et cetera, right? All of these high stakes scenarios. Do you want a transcript of this? So then it becomes a balance between access and participation, and whose participation is valued or not. And that's where that tension between possibility and refusal is really striking to me, because of the complexities, but also because I think many institutional actors are too quick to say it's better that this person doesn't participate than it is for us to think about the complexities of access.
Thank you so much. Let's go to the next slide. So I really love the ambivalence that has been coming through in the book and here on the panel about possibility and refusal. They can happen at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other, and I think that's so powerful. So moving on to, there's a few chapters that touch on digital diagnosis, and I was really struck by something that you argue in the text, which is that we need self-diagnosis, and this is especially true when medical professionals are likely to misdiagnose or to dismiss some of the things people are experiencing. And of course, I think this resonates quite a bit with trans health, where there are so many medical questions that are just not actually answerable because there's such a lack of research in the space. And it's a case where patients are often the experts rather than doctors. And so in the context that you were looking at in the book, in this absence of reliable medical guidance, people often turn to each other in digital spaces for this critical health knowledge. So my question here is, how can marginalized groups balance the risks that are inherent in that, risks of misinformation, things like that, with this necessity of community-sourced expertise?
I'm guessing I should start. And there are a few people who are not here with us, so I hope I'm accurately channeling them. So Oliver, what you were noting about comparisons to trans health really resonates. And I'm thinking in particular, many of the anti-trans narratives that circulate often hinge on this notion of certainty, that like you have to be certain you are trans. And I think there's a parallel that you have to be certain not only that you have a disability or a chronic illness, but you have to be certain that you've got the right designation. And I think a lot of that demand for certainty comes from clinical and institutional actors, and it doesn't necessarily emerge from community spaces in quite the same way. So I think partly, I know when we wrote that chapter, we specifically didn't want to focus on misinformation, in large part because that focus on uncertainty, getting diagnosed with the wrong thing, oh, the horror if a teenager thinks they might have Tourette's because of TikTok. We wanted to push back on that and think, what would it mean to just have prolific, unchecked, rampant self-diagnosis, like everybody self-diagnose, and to think about self-diagnosis as not just a paraclinical, but in some ways an anti-clinical kind of digital space or formation. But I think too, right, like partly this is like, so what if you're trans today and not tomorrow, and then again the day after you're trans again, right? Like, so what if you are autistic right now, but in like 30 days you're not autistic, or, right? Like, these are permeable ways of being and coming to identity and community. And I think the misinformation question where we didn't go, but I think where it gets really super complex and interesting and fraught and potentially bad, is that sometimes in these sort of self-diagnosis spaces, and I'll say this is especially the case for what I've seen on autistic TikTok or Autist Talk, is sometimes people re-entrench categories or proliferate categories in ways that propagate harm. Like there's this whole notion of what constitutes quote unquote female autism, which then starts bordering on anti-trans formations of what constitutes autism. So you can see some of that categorization happening. So I think if we had kept writing, that is the direction we would have gone. And I don't know if other folks have things to add.
Yeah, I think one of the things about this question that's interesting to me as well is the community-sourced expertise versus misinformation. I'm not sure that that's the binary that I would put that in either. Like I almost want to put it as like community-sourced expertise versus like institutional expertise or like medical expertise, because we talk about this in this chapter as well, but like about people who are left outside of like clinical diagnosis, the folks who were not instrumental to, considered instrumental to modern day psychiatry, even in terms of where we get our diagnoses from. And I have literally this week just sent an endorsement, like a blurb cover for a book coming out in May called by Marieka Big, called No Such Thing as Normal, which basically like takes on the whole field of psychiatry. It's really good. Like I think it's going to be great. But one of the things that I think she makes really clear in this is about the limits of like how we got to this point of this biologically rooted, like this is something that we can, this is how we define these, this way of being. This is like what well looks like. These are the like how we can where diagnosis comes from, and like how a lot of this is built on pathologizing specific communities that hysteria, the history of hysteria in medical context that removes context of the women that were being studied at the time, thinking about the origins of thinking about schizophrenia and how it became a black disease and drapetomania and all this stuff. Like all of these, like the roots of it are not this neutral thing anyway. So if we're thinking about a community-sourced expertise, a lot of what marginalized minority communities have had to do when it comes to healthcare have been having to protect each other outside of this institutional reach that we have anyway. So really, all these digital spaces are doing is allowing for more of that course correction to happen. It's not something that wasn't happening anyway in like an like a grassroots type of way in the first place, right? And I think that part of this community-sourced expertise, part of it has to be about addressing the, what if we also think about the ways that the world is not well. Like, what if the problem is not just me? The problem is, or the problem isn't me at all. Like, what if the problem is like the environment that I'm in too? And I think that that's something that community-sourced expertise can get at. That, like the sort of like medical, industrial side of things can't always. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think I just want to respond to this questioning of misinformation, which I think is so important in this space because there's oftentimes medical professionals we can't really trust. And so what we have to go on is so many people's different experiences, and some of them may apply to you and others may not. And it's, I think, really hard sometimes to sort that out.
Just listening to the question, it kind of made me realize that of course, certainly in this chapter, the desiring diagnosis, but also in the following chapter, searching for digital wellness, and probably some of the other chapters as well, it's like, how can it not be, right? But the specter of misinformation and conspiratorial thinking is kind of everywhere in this book, where it's like, how do you engage a sort of critique of medical establishments or mainstream technologies without kind of risking that, I don't know, that pull towards that? Not to say any of us are engaging in kind of conspiratorial thinking or, I don't know, but I think that's what's kind of interesting, is how do you kind of draw the line? And so I think similarly with the searching for digital wellness chapter, which I was more involved in, we wrote a lot about how this kind of wellness industrial complex, a lot of it easily tilts into conspiracy theories about, like anti-vax rhetoric or like other things, right, about kind of quack medicine and so on. But at the same time, what we kind of advocated for in that chapter was searching for kind of community-based wisdom, similarly, to be able to kind of vet what is truly, well or healthy for each of us. So even when that might fly in the face of certain kinds of medical wisdom. So again, that's not saying, the medical establishment is not ever to be believed and is false, but at the same time, like trying to find where you can kind of compensate for what it lacks and doesn't acknowledge.
I'll just add really quickly, I love the diagnoses chapter. It's one of my favorites in the book, and this question of conspiracy is interesting to me because it also, or just like the language of conspiracy, because it gets at this question about whose stories are deemed more trustworthy and what kind of narrative power is imbued within particular, tellings of one's kind of bodily or psychical experiences. And ultimately, I feel like there's this, it's about, I just love the chapter because it also kind of includes these brief little nods to scammers and spoofers in the history of psychiatry. And it's really about the ways in which, how do we gain access to these spaces, and what are the stories? How do we even if we're kind of taking on these narrativizing ourselves in ways that we're not used to, like how do we gain access to these spaces? So it's really about access.
Yeah, the one thing I would like to add is I agree with folks. The part that I really love about this chapter is that it really problematizes the whole pathway of disease, diagnosis, treatment, and cure. And it destabilizes this whole narrative. And part of it is like what I really love about the people who spent the most time working in that chapter is that as a person who has spent a lot of times in reports from Excel sheets and the aggregation of human existence, aggregation of treatment, bodies, it's about we're not all the same and really embracing that individuality. And so how do we go from the coagulation of the aggregate to the smooth silkiness of the individual? And so that was the part I really loved about the chapter is how do we break these kind of medicalized treatment models that are seen as the ultimate way of knowing our bodies, ourselves, and how do we actually reconnect with what we know? And part of it was about individuals have a lot of understanding and experience with their bodies, and how can we not embrace that and champion that?
Yeah, thank you. I love the way that you all have just really talked about the complexity of people's conditions and identities that really just don't fit into the simplicity of diagnoses very well. So I want to move on to the content in the book about digital nostalgia. And you discuss nostalgia for platforms like Black Planet and Asian Avenue that are tied in some cases to this early internet aesthetic that you describe in the book as flawed or ugly in some senses, but also their role as communal homes for people who share aspects of identity. So I was wondering about how you see this insular nature. So the shared identity factoring into the nostalgia, and do you see parallels to current platforms as people are increasingly leaving some of these mainstream platforms like X and Facebook and moving to more private or identity-based spaces? I give the example of Discord servers, but we could also think about group chats or any number of places where people gather with others who are similar in some way.
Yeah, I can start. I feel like I spent a lot of time thinking about digital nostalgia in these chapters. And I mean, it's interesting that I guess I want to get to the question, but maybe just talk a little bit about kind of what we were thinking through in terms of this question of nostalgia, which was something that we've been trying to perhaps, and it's kind of a slippery term, as a lot of the terminology in the book. They're kind of these shifting targets in some ways, but a lot of us have been thinking about the kind of newness that's being pressed upon us in terms of conversations about AI and this, next stage of Web3 and blockchain and this kind of impending sense of just being pulled into the future that also at the same time has conjured these nostalgic aesthetics. I mean, Web3 is in some ways kind of drawing from a lot of Web 2.0 nostalgia in the ways that NFTs and game cultures kind of permeate Web3 spaces. Also, just recently, I feel like there's been kind of, even in pop culture, like films that are kind of pulling on, a nostalgic pull, like the movie DD is really much like this kind of digital nostalgia film. The episode in, what's that TV show? The one with the AIM. Pen 15 has that whole. Yes. So we've been. I guess this is kind of our attempt of trying to think about how do we make sense of the temporal dimensions in which we move through platforms and updates and all of these different registers of the internet. And this idea of nostalgia, really, when we break it down in the book, is this kind of longing for home, and this idea of home that is both a kind of orientation to a place or a feeling or an aesthetic or perhaps a particular space. So, I mean, as I was reading this chapter again, or these chapters, I was thinking about, reflecting on what has made certain spaces home for me online. What does that look like? Is it simply the places that I engage with the most? And it's often not been that. And what does that actually mean? And what does home actually conjure? So, the idea of home is tied to ideas of hospitality, of hosting, of welcoming and treating people like guests as welcomed into a space, which is a different kind of logic than, viewing people in a space as users or, data bodies, which is in some ways the kind of contemporary digital present that we're living in, or have been living in for a while. So in some ways, I think, Remi, you were talking a little bit about the impermanence of diagnosis and the ephemerality of identifying. And I think this through line also finds our way as we try to think about the usefulness of nostalgia in terms of how we feel at home in digital spaces. And in some ways it might look like a particular platform. I mean, Discord, as a gamer, I'm somewhat familiar with Discord, but there's also plenty of other platforms as well that end up becoming kind of homey spaces. And I think what is interesting about these chapters is that we're not necessarily focused on like thinking about what are the kind of ideal spaces or platforms or a particular kind of platform logic that we need to replicate, but finding kind of bits and pieces of, you know, looking at Black Planet and Asian Avenue and older kind of sites that were very much about customization and kind of creating an aesthetic that was welcoming, and locating and identifying these gestures to perhaps kind of collect a relationship to digital spaces that isn't necessarily kind of uniform, in some ways gentrified. You know, there's a kind of very uniform approach to, you know, the platforms that dominate social media today. So I guess getting to the question, I feel like there's ways in which, do you see parallels today as people increasingly leave mainstream platforms? I think there's perhaps a need for connection outside of these platforms that are, you know, perhaps a little bit more makeshift and ephemeral. And I guess that's what I was trying to gesture to in terms of Remi's comments. Discord isn't necessarily organized in a way that is, I don't know if it's an identity-based space. I feel like it's so much more organized around activity and a particular kind of task or a kind of feeling that draws you to, you know, Discord. I use it and kind of still hold on to other platforms as well. So I think, yeah, so I've been kind of rambling a little bit, but yes, yeah.
Thinking about the, you know, what you just said about like having, you know, these different spaces that have different purposes to them as well, right? I think at this point we're moving towards a sort of multiple homes, you know, or have moved. You don't, I can't remember, I'm trying to think way back to when I had a MySpace. But I think when I had a MySpace, I think I just had a MySpace. That and like maybe MSN as well. And you know, you had, which to me mimics the like home place plus a group chat type of thing with your MSN, AIM, Messenger situation. Whereas now, like, I'm still dancing between all of these places. I went back to Facebook for the first time in forever to post about the book. Like, it was crazy, you know, like that was a long time ago since I've been there. But, you know, I still have it. And the reason why I still have it and why we all have multiple of these spaces is because they now occupy this, well, maybe you don't, right? Okay, off grid, we get it. But I think that, like, you know, we have all of these spaces because they do meet these different needs, right? But also because they are necessary to the curation of an archive and like maintaining control over our own like data, our own data histories, but also like, you know, I won't delete that because I have like, that's like all of the pictures of me as a teen. I don't have any of those physically anymore. So, so you know, when it comes to even just the ways that people perform, like these users perform like meta-narrative histories, and everyone, do you remember this event on Twitter when this happened or whatever? And there's all these frequent callbacks, and that's part of using it. Like part of the nostalgia is the thing. Like the nostalgia is the activity that makes the place a home as well, that allows you to call back to all these other spaces. So they become, you know, obviously that sort of trans-platform network and web that means that they all are in service to this. So, you know, like ooh, gosh, that was almost bad. The thinking about leaving them is like difficult here, because I know that quite a few people I know have now like left X permanently, and you know, if I didn't like still think about it and write about it, maybe I would have done that too. But I do think that even thinking about platforms in their lifespan from like what happens when things, like, it's rare, they don't ever like vanish. There's very few like social networks that have like stopped, right? Like some of them are still there and have like legacy users who just aren't using it. But the idea about like what happens when they are archived, what happens when they're in decline, what does that actually look like in terms of like their user base and in terms of their importance to us socially? I don't know that that's like a like leaving mainstream practice. And then, you know, as for the private identity-based spaces, like you do have those in parallel, you know, like even when I was using Twitter more than anything else, I still had my mainstream, you know, I had Twitter and then I had my group chats. I still had the DMs where I would discuss what was happening on, you know, I had this like public within it that was like private. So I think that we are just like still performing those same practices just across a different set of places?
Well, yeah, so it's interesting hearing you all talk about home, because I enter that conversation about nostalgia from a kind of different place, right? I can't think about it outside of Svetlana Boym's work about nostalgia, restorative and reflective nostalgia. And right, putting it in historical context, nostalgia is that early disease, or early 19th century or early 20th century military people were missing home, and how do you cure them from their missing home? And as you're talking about home, it just is coming full circle in many ways about what that feeling is. But of course, it brings up the question of like the memory of that, and how tenuous and problematic memory can be, and even in the context of digital space, where the assumption that memory has a high level of accuracy, and it continues to be tenuous, and it gets back to this question about, I think, you're back to the question about these identity place spaces, and I think it brings up the question of how hard it is to find homes. I think some of us have very welcoming homes, some of us don't, but I think for me, the book is really trying to work through that tension of where are places of solace, and that may not be home, and how do you, in a sense, vacillate between these places which are restorative and creative and inspiring, and other places that may be damning and difficult.
There's sort of two nostalgia chapters, right? One is nostalgia gone to bits, right? And the other one is the longing for home, which is the one that talks more about MySpace and the homepage. And oh my God, I just completely blanked what I was gonna say. But I think that one of the things that I found really interesting, at least in the one about home pages, is the kind of aesthetics and spatial metaphors that are being referenced in that. So this kind of analogizing the home page to a home, but specifically in this kind of, oh, I know what I was gonna say. I was gonna say that I think that these chapters provide a kind of interesting history of the internet, where this kind of, I guess, what would it be, like early Web 2.0, but this kind of early aughts MySpace moment, where the customization required to create your own home page often involves some kind of rudimentary coding, right, HTML and so on. But it's also this kind of remediation, right, of like what a teenager might do to their bedroom, but instead it's like, when you load my MySpace page, it plays song lyrics, and you can do all these customizations, and the idea, right, was that you're hosting visitors by coming to your site, which is very different, as that chapter writes about, from the kind of attention economy logic of virality with something like TikTok, where you don't really visit a home page in the same way. And so in the first nostalgia chapter, I had, just for whatever reason, my TikTok algorithm was feeding me this, and I don't see it anymore, so maybe that trend is over, but this kind of bedroom TikTok trend, where it kind of goes back to what Ray was saying about nostalgia, but the idea that one can be nostalgic for a time, you never lived through. So these, younger TikTok users basing their entire account on making their bedroom look like it's from the 80s or the 70s and dressing accordingly. But that still seems to me really different from that MySpace homepage, because the idea here is still to generate likes and reposts and so on. And it's not, I don't know, it doesn't have that same feeling. So I don't know, I think that spatial analog seems like, I don't know if something like Discord or Reddit or these message boards really have that, because again, it's not visiting the page with that kind of customization. I think maybe what was also being discussed in that chapter is a kind of feeling of intimacy that maybe is lost with the kind of viral logic. And so just as a sort of anecdote, I was thinking about, there's a class I'm teaching that's just an intro to new media technologies class, and the students, as a sort of informal discussion post, had to create a timeline of the new media technologies they had used. And so it was kind of an exercise in nostalgia, because depending on the person's age, right, they would say, oh yeah, I remember when I used MySpace or Facebook or whatever it was. And then they had to choose, like, if you could only use one app for the rest of your life, what would it be and why? And so of course a lot of people were like TikTok, YouTube, et cetera. But I will, this one student said, if I could only use one app for the rest of my life, it would be the phone call app, because I would be able to, talk to friends and family and like call 911 in an emergency. They're very pragmatic. And of course, I'm a millennial, so I was like, that's hilarious. I've never thought of the phone call app as an app, but I guess it is an app. But it also, it was kind of interesting because I had just assumed everyone to talk about social media and these very large scale networking sites. But this was just so modest and so intimate in a way. It was like, no, I just need the phone call app. So I don't know. There's something there, I think.
Just going to say really quickly, Lida, following off of what you were saying about the question of can you be nostalgic for a time or a space that never was, and thinking about the home chapter in particular. At one moment, we engage with Joe Shu's book, Constellating Home, where Shu thinks about home as a process, so homing, right, and the frictions that come through that. And I think especially in trying to think about disability spaces, there's often a nostalgia for long form writing, like the days of disability blogs, but then that nostalgia is also one born of friction because there has never been a truly accessible digital space, right? And so those moments of longing become a moment in which one maybe found access on a particular platform, in a particular space, in a particular digital moment.
Have one final question, then we'll open it up for audience Q&A as well as Zoom. So I do want to ask about the collaborative writing process. So we absolutely have to talk about how that came about. So for those who don't know, I saw some surprised faces in the crowd earlier. This was all written in 1 week, right? One week was all it took. 4 days. And that's incredible, right? And something that caught our attention when we read the book was that each chapter isn't actually attributed to any one specific author, which is very, very different for humanities writers, right? Where the first author, single author, is very emphasized. So now that we're, here at the finish line, we're here at the book launch, we're curious to hear what motivated that decision to make it more of a collaborative practice, how that went for each of you. Were there moments of resonance, dissonance, maybe conflict? And for future groups hoping to engage in similar practice, what insights would you give them? Would you tell them hey, you should really do this, or what should you watch out for?
So I would just say yes to all the above, meaning that, it's hard for, I would say, academics who have been driven to write your own words to get to a place where you're saying, I'm going to put these words down, and then someone else can change them. And I think I would always say it takes a huge dose of epistemic humility to be able to manage how we work together. So I'll just leave it at that. Would I recommend it to others? I recommend it to others when I say you have to like each other. I think that's honestly the most important piece. Besides having something to write about, but yeah, having the ability to say that I'm willing to walk into this room with people, share my words, have them be rewritten, reconfigured, and be fine with that, because the end goal is to say something collectively and collaboratively. So instead of being the single author or the single solitary voice, it's about producing something collaboratively. And I think we all do our own individual writing, but this is one part of the work we're trying to do, and really trying to reshape how, in my perspective, reshape how we do humanistic inquiry.
I think that was a lot about sort of practicing what we preach as well, because we're talking a lot about our own lived experiences in it, which is where a lot of the little anecdotal pieces in it came, which was a really nice. Those were so in between that urge of practicing a distance from it, where it's I've written this thing and maybe I care and this is how I feel about this thing, but it might get deleted and that's okay. That forces a real humility, especially if someone disagrees with what you have to say, but you're trying to say one thing together. That's a tricky thing to do. But then those little anecdotes were, I guess, a space that kind of countered that you could be well, this probably isn't going to change much because this is attributed to me. So I think it did do a little bit of both of those things, because coming away and being happy with the overall message is when you might have like, you know, we're talking about something that, you know, as you correctly pointed out at the beginning, like could be seen as like quite a binary, you know, like refusal or opportunity. And that's like, we all feel differently about that, but have overwhelmingly agreed that we felt a little bit more towards the optimistic side. But that can still be, especially when you're talking about engaging with tools and technologies that impact us in very different ways based on our own positionality as 14 authors, you know, like it's very difficult to reach consensus on how do I feel about this specific thing. So yeah, that's all. Like the other little bits inside the little anecdotes were like a real moment for me to feel like, well, I said my thing here and I can feel good about this as well as the overall message.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely very challenging, I think, in the kind of compressed time frame. But I think one of the reasons for the success, which Lisa and others have alluded to, is, you know, the fact that we had staff with us, we had facilitators, we had the person doing the audiovisual transcripts, and all of these things kind of allowed us to really just focus on the writing and the thinking itself. And I feel like just narrating my own relationship to this project in the very beginning, and even just as we kind of approached our first round of edits, maybe just as a trained critic, I'm just seeing all of the stuff that's not working or missing and what is not perfect. And then the more distance I've had with the project, the more I've like just realized kind of a particular mode of thinking that we were able to tap into just in the process of co-writing, which like co-writing, I think people have emphasized, was also like you don't leave comments in a Google Doc, you go in and change, you know, the actual chapter if you feel like it needs to be said differently or improved or just like there. So it really challenged a lot of, you know, our own comforts with just the ownership of ideas, or even just feeling like your ideas there aren't fully baked, but trusting someone else to kind of bake them for you a little bit. And like even just reading sections that I know that I read, I'm like kind of estranged from my own words, because I feel like, I don't know, like there's something about maybe just the mind meld of it that even moments where I feel like, oh, I think I wrote this, but then it also feels a little bit like language that someone else, that I know, that I in my head kind of contribute to someone else in the group. And it becomes really fascinating to me, just, I mean, reflecting on my own experience reading it. I'm like both like author and reader at the same time, like, and it's something that, you know, just having 14 people in a room, I might collaborate again, I hope to collaborate again, but it won't be the same in terms of the 14 people. Like, we'll never have the same 14 people in the room. And there's something, you know, I think with distance from the project, I'm kind of seeing the evidence of that kind of shine through in the book. And I also have, I mean, many kind of, if people are interested in thinking about collaboration and collective writing, we can talk more about specifics and tips and tricks.
Yeah, I don't want to say too much because I know we want to move to questions, but I guess what I would say is the analogy I always use is the exquisite corpse, where like someone draws the head and someone draws the body and someone draws the feet or whatever, and you unfold it and it's like, how did this come together? It definitely has some of that element for me, but then of course in the editorial process, we smoothed it over. And so just sort of for transparency, like yes, there were some people who were more involved in drafting certain chapters, which is why certain people speak more about certain chapters than others, but it really was collaborative in that everybody edited, some people worked on transitions, the kind of collective brainstorming of like, what are the chapters gonna be about and what's gonna unite them. I really do think this could be a really promising mode of writing and thinking in the humanities. I don't think of it at all as a substitute for kind of solo authored writing. I also don't think this mode of writing is conducive to sort of deep historical or archival research, right? That's not the kind of work that it is. But for this kind of more speculative or kind of, very, very present day way of kind of thinking through topics, I think it can work really well. But was there conflict? Like, sure. Do we all agree on everything? No. But I think that is really interesting to go in and read it and see sort of, I probably wouldn't have written this, but like it still works somehow. So I think a lot of us probably were nervous, like, is anyone actually going to want to read this? But it seems like they do, and you do, so that's good.
Yeah, I think, Ray, when you had started this questions thread, you had mentioned trust. And I think that paired with trust, there was also this element of care throughout the writing process. I mean, really communal care. And I think that was also borne out by the fact that we are all very different writers and have very different ways of writing. So some of us type, some of us use speech to text. Some of us are morning people. For some in our group, 10 p.m. was the start of the day. And I think on top of all of that, what others were mentioning, I think Lida just recently about, some people jumping in with transitions or adding anecdotes or citation material. There was very much an act of care as well as trust there in that, I was definitely among the group of people who was working on a chapter, and I got so frustrated with the chapter, I wanted to set it on fire and like put it down a river and wave goodbye to it and never see it again. And other people very like lovingly came in and took over that chapter. And so there are all of these really, I think, lovely moments of people caring for one another, knowing how horrible writing can be.
And thank you. All right, we can take audience questions. So I guess we'll start with folks in the room. You can raise your hand. I suppose someone will run over with the microphone, and then we'll have disembodied voices for the online. Yes. So questions. Do we have any Zoom questions? Otherwise, we skipped over one question to give time for audience Q&A, and it's a spicy one. And yeah.
We do have a Zoom questions. Maybe we'll start with that. This question is from P.F. Anderson, and they say, having not yet read the book, I'm curious if there are discussion about AI for accessibility or as an assistive tech support for folks with disabilities. The way generative AI can be a harm and a good, a barrier and a tool to get past. There's definitely pros and cons, and I think that a disability framing is an excellent position from which to implement technoskepticism. What do you all think?
This is Remi. Everyone's looking at me. So I will start. I think, so in terms of the disability-specific and health-oriented moments in the book, AI gets taken up in some ways, and I think that the questions that are being asked also do get taken up in a variety of ways in the Blackness, Style, and AI chapters as well, because there's this tension of like, AI, there's a lot that's really terrible about AI, and yet there are ways in which we can think about, I think the conversation earlier went to co-optation, appropriation, remaking. And I think especially, with disability-oriented examples, like one example of, that comes to mind is how often the language of disability is used to talk about the harms of AI, right? So even like the rhetoric of parroting or hallucination, these are disability-specific terms. So what does it mean to actually think about parroting and hallucination as modes of knowledge and style, right? And so that could be a way of also thinking about this not only co-optation question, but a way in which we can infuse the sort of critical consciousness values orientation. And sorry, Rianna, now I'm looking at you because you're nodding, so.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question one more time as well, so I can, because there was one thing.
Yes. So the question says, having not yet read the book, I'm curious if there's discussion around AI for accessibility or as an assistive tech support for folks with disabilities. The way generative AI can be a harm and a good, a barrier and a tool to get past. There's definitely pros and cons, and I think a disability framing is an excellent position from which to implement technoskepticism. What do you think?
Well, okay, so thank you. Of course, we turn to the chapters that I think, as Remi's just pointed out, that engage with AI the most are the 5 and 6 about blackness and AI and blackness and style. And I think even just to tie it back to our last full panel question about the collaborative process, is that this book is, even in the way that we're talking about possibility here, it opens more questions than anything. Like the mode of writing, the way that it actually ended up turning out, means that like a lot of these, there's lots of ways that all of this stuff is very clearly applicable to other stuff. The fact that we did this together in summer of 2023, the experimentation that we did with ChatGPT that this chapter's built on would be completely different if we did it right now. At the time when we were doing it, the chapter playing with Black style about ChatGPT's ability to mimic styles and mimic different like voices at this point. Like we were talking about whether it was possible to consider it like as a co-opter of Black styles of speech, or if it's like a co-participant in it, in the way we think about remix and blah blah blah. But the point is that like at that point in time, it was just, you could just do text, right? You'd ask it questions and you say, can you respond to us in respond to us as though you're a Black Londoner, respond to us as in AAVE, read the Declaration of Independence in AAVE, now read it in patois, read it in a Creole, so it's those are the questions we were asking it to do. But at this point, now you could get it to actually say it aloud to you, right? So kind of shortly after that, so in just like the 2 years since we did that, now with like a lot of the things that we were foretelling and forecasting and saying, hey, it's not doing this that well right now. Now it's doing it way better, and it's doing it out loud, which changes so much about that conversation. But the point I'm making is that the way that we wrote that then still gives us the tools to talk about how I'm now talking about it less than 2 years later. And even some of the things that we did in that space in terms of jailbreaking it to force it to do things that it couldn't yet do, and that kind of very communally minded, like, when you're creating jailbreak terms to like override the capacities of a tool, that's like a prompt that's being worked out amongst a community online. Like, they're developing this prompt, right? And every time having to like, again, it really comes from that sort of skeptical perspective. Like, we're going over superseding what the ability of the tech to do a little bit more than it was, and get it to do the thing that we need it to do. To me, that like is very much in keeping with that conversation about like disability justice. Like, how can we like navigate this to, so what I'm saying is that in that chapter, whilst we're not explicitly addressing that, a lot of the conversations about the harms and about co-optation and about getting what you need out of a tool, and about not being overwritten or written out of conversations, or allowing for co-optation to like supersede your humanity is very much the same conversation to me. And in terms of where this has gone now, a lot of the things that have come to light since the publication of that chapter is people thinking about what ChatGPT speak looks like and what it sounds like and what ChatGPT's style is. And a lot of times that is, people saying that they can recognize when something's been written by ChatGPT, and thinking about the human labor and the human costs of that, and the fact that like a large part of the people who are like programming and the corpus of data that goes into training these LLMs and so on is being drawn from folks in the global south and being drawn, So when there's like conversations about like if it uses the word delve, I know that ChatGPT's done it, when actually at that point you could say yes, it might be you might think it's ChatGPT, or it could be a Nigerian uncle using this kind of language as well, which is where the dichotomy kind of came to a head in that. So I think that even when we think about how the tool itself is causing harm and what like capacity for harm and who is being harmed, that's like a long view that the chapter has to have and that the book has to have.
Is it on? Oh. Hi. What an amazingly intellectually generative conversation for a Friday afternoon in Michigan in February. Thank you. I have a compliment and a question. As a discourse analyst, not a rhetorician, but a discourse analyst, I just really want to point out the use of language in the book, but also in the conversation. really hold that up as something that critical cultural scholars can do and do really well. And just looking at all the questions that Oliver and Wells offered, you know, each one was so generative in thinking about how you are using those words and how those words in particular draw up different types of conversations. You know, in the community sourced question, I'm thinking, what is community sourced? You know, alt-right, red pill, that's community sourced, right? And in the nostalgia question, I'm thinking nostalgia also means safety, you know, so then what is the relationship between safety and home? Those things aren't the same thing, right? So I just really appreciate the use of language and its relationship to power, because I think that's something that we all do well, right? And then my question is selfish, because I'm thinking about the DSI Summer Institute, which is coming up. Apply if you're a grad student or early career scholar, please. And I am thinking about the words that we are using, which are brokenness and survival and anti-intellectualism. And I'm trying to find where on this, whatever it is, spectrum, tension, whatever it is, between these terms of possibility and potential and refusal, where you might put some of this other language of brokenness, of survivalism, and anti-intellectual environments. So really, it's not, I'm just kind of curious where the panel might think that those terms fit. And I want to flag those terms as not necessarily dispiriting, but also harnessing the potential of those. Thanks.
I mean, first of all, thank you for the compliment. I think this book really is so much about language, as like Rianna just suggested, right, with all of this playing with style, and then also being very cognizant about how do we as a collective use language, you know, even deciding we're going to use the collective we unless there's a personalized anecdote that really speaks to a personal lived experience. It would be weird to claim that we. So I think we all thought a lot about our choices of language. Brokenness, survivalism, and anti-intellectualism, or the last one, I guess I would put separately, but the first two, the brokenness and the survivalism, to me, that actually fits very well with the skeptical framework. That's sort of what I was saying earlier about the kind of, there's a certain kind of like naivete in using the same old language of sort of resistance and, you know, the language of like maybe what would have been the avant-garde or something. This is where I really like, actually Anna Watkins-Fisher used to teach here, right? Her work on parasitical resistance, where it's like the only way maybe to resist is to be a parasite within the host, and the kind of focus on survival and endurance rather than this kind of old mode. But as I said, I don't think it has to be pessimistic necessarily. So I think, I don't know if that answers the question, but I feel like it's part of the same kind of conversation. Is like, how do we not just be 100% doom and gloom, but at the same time recognize that the old tactics of subversion don't really apply or work anymore?
I think on the survival side of things as well, that makes, like, I agree that really aligns quite nicely with the technoskeptical lens and, you know, way of behavior as a tool type of thing, right? Because, you know, what we talk about in those, particularly the Blackness and AI chapters, is the fugitivity is what we use in thinking about a skeptical outlook as being a fugitive, like, perspective, like the adaptation in style and style changing, and whether we're thinking about tools co-opting and like sort of superseding us, or versus us playing with, working with, making fun of, is like kind of the difference in the survival tactic here. So this idea that like the whole, like we talk about signifying as a like mode of resistance, and about it as a tool of saying something in plain sight, a double speak type of thing, as like a very black rhetorical mode. And this idea is that you know, that is a fugitive behavior of like evading surveillance and remixing language to stay one step ahead. So the idea that I think the question that actually started those two chapters was when Kevin Winstead said, can ChatGPT learn as fast as a black child plays? That was the question that made us start playing with it in the first place. And it was this idea that like, well, terms stop being cool all the time, and it can't co-produce with us. It can only kind of co-opt what's been put in. So is it possible for it to do the remix of going a step ahead, going faster? You know, so that was like almost, so the idea was survival and fugitivity, but that being actually a place of optimism. You know, it's okay, we won't be supplanted because we're faster. So.
Well, yeah, so I think part of it is, you know, the brokenness. The first thing that came to mind when you mentioned that term was probably side conversations I had with Remi and Andre about fuck around and find out. And the idea of breaking things, not you know, the other kind of word of being disruptive, but actually breaking things that need to be broken because of they don't work for you, whether it be race, gender, class, otherwise, and the opportunity that affords you, the freedom, the flexibility, the creative opportunities that can be expressed in those moments. So that's my little comment about that.
Hi, my name's Lauren. Thank you all for your really wonderful and interesting thoughts in this panel and in this book. I was really interested in and really liked Rianna's response about the like binary, non-binary between misinformation and community source expertise, that maybe it's something more like institutional expertise and community source expertise. And I feel like this kind of tension, I see it in a lot of the things that y'all are talking about. I feel like there's something there in nostalgia, and even in like this question of the tension between possibility and refusal. I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts about how this sort of tension between institutional expertise and community source expertise might map on to some of the other kind of tensions that you're talking about. And I also wonder if you have thoughts about where misinformation does end up falling within those spectrums. And I know you talked a little bit about it, but yeah, I would be interested to know what you all think.
Sorry, I'm just loading. Yeah, okay, so I think that if we're thinking about the, yeah, done loading. The thinking about the binary between institutional versus community form stuff, again, like I see where that maps into, again, I'm gonna keep talking about those two chapters now, but this, if what we're being very much kind of force-fed AI conversations, and in terms of a lot of pivoting work towards it, a lot of funds in it, a lot of it's very inescapable and inevitable at this point, right? In the way that we're talking about it too, and by centering the possibility of harms and the harms that have been done and the harms that may come, and I don't even know, did we even get onto talking about some of the environmental impacts in the book or any of that? Like, we did a bit? Yeah, cool. So, like we're trying to sort of move the needle back to thinking about it, but also like the response from us as the Disco network as a network, but also us thinking about community responses to this as well. Like a lot of us talk about our own, again, like turning to the wellness and disability in chapters as well, and thinking about how we engage with a lot of like digital wellness apps and things like that is, and even thinking about like the digital body doubling and aspects like that. A lot of that was about very strongly community rooted activities in response to. So I've jumbled up two things there, this sort of institutional push towards thinking about using AI, where like we were all talking about, the conversation hasn't even really been about refusal of AI from an institutional perspective. It's very it's very difficult to say at this point, no, you cannot use this in the classroom. No, you cannot use this full stop. There's a lot of like, here's how you can use it. You know, like the conversation is often about engagement. And I suppose we're sort of, a lot of what our focus is on in the book is about like some of our own, first of all, our own behaviors and community grounded behaviors that allow us to navigate different technologies. So it's a bit of both. I think that's where we put ourselves.
Yeah, just to add on, I mean, what I'm also hearing in the question, which is something that our book addresses, is like the various different scales of knowledge production, and I'm glad you mentioned the kind of planetary. Yeah, because I mean, we were writing this book in the rural, in a retreat in rural Pennsylvania. Shout out to the Highlights Foundation, which is where we, actually, for the Highlights children's book. But this was right after the Montreal fires that were seeping down the East Coast. So there was a way in which, our attention to like our kind of inward practice of retreating into the pages was also, writing about digital technology and these larger forms of, thinking about the scales in which AI and other socio-technical systems are implicated in these larger extractive histories and legacies that are then, just very physically around us, gets us to think about all of these different, scales that we're like trying to think through. Our wellness chapter actually starts on the level of thinking about planetary unwellness. But I guess my kind of more direct answer to your question is, I feel like this question of, it also gets me to think about like where are we locating knowledge production, and I think a lot of it's imperfect because it's only a sampling, but the inclusion of the personal anecdotes and thinking about the very specific embodied illustrations of some of the theoretical concepts that we're thinking through. I feel like there's a lot of richness in those moments that I guess really resonated with me when I was returning to the project as a kind of entryway into thinking about the community knowledges that we have been a part of and engaging with and contributing to as we've all tried to kind of make sense and home in the various digital spaces that we engage with.
We have one question from the Zoom, so I'm going to go ahead and ask that. So this question asks about the creative use of wellness apps, and if you could talk a little bit more about what you shared in the book.
And I will say this is probably our last question because we only have a few minutes left.
The creative use of wellness apps. There's a kind of, now I've gone back and looked at it, I keep looking at this section and going, oh, self-indulgent, Ray. But there is a fairly long anecdote from me about my use of wellness apps with some pictures of like how chaotic it is for me as well. So there are, I've talked about multiple of these apps that are like sort of carrot versus stick, that are, written kitten, as like where you get kittens when you write 100 words, versus like write or die, where they delete your work behind you if you don't write fast enough. And and then a lot of the like tomato timers and flora, where they plant trees for you if you work without focus, without touching your phone for a while, and if you touch your phone, you kill a tree, and they go, you killed the tree, and then the screen goes red, and there's a little stick tree. It's very, very distressing. And, like part of like doing that has just been me gamifying my wellness to keep myself, it's funny, because again, writing this at the time, didn't have an ADHD diagnosis, was very much writing about self-diagnosis. Shortly after, went and got one. So yes, got, institutional, oops. But that's I needed it. So that, this was the like wellness apps, like as a way around care, that like a lot of it was very, again, this sort of communally minded stuff, because for me, almost the only thing I can do to trick myself into working is having like outside accountability and people that I write with, and someone to bully me into doing stuff. So the communal writing situation is probably like the only way I can really publish. But like I think that this section, for me, I don't know how everyone else, I can't even remember if anyone else went on about it in the degree that I did, unfortunately. But the wellness apps and like gamifying it and using tech as a tool to help me, but also thinking about exactly how reliant on it I became to get anything done as a plaster solution over not having access to the institutional support and resources that I really want. Because I used that as well as a way of talking about some of the flaws in diagnoses and difficulty that I had in getting a diagnosis, particularly whilst I was in the UK versus here. So I think that, to me, the technology in that way became that was like a really optimistic solution for me at the time. It covered a loss. So it became something that was about possibility, that was about potential for me when I wasn't able to access certain other things. That's all I have to say about that.
Sorry, too aggressive. I think what we were trying to do in that chapter also was, is it sort of too late for wellness? Is this a term sort of like self-care that's just been, evacuated of meaning? It's entirely, an industrial complex. So is there anything, to be redeemed in wellness? And so thinking about some of these kind of meditation apps, which I kind of wrote my own spin-off piece, which is very much informed by some of the conversations here, which is that a lot of these mainstream mindfulness apps, like especially Headspace and Calm, and there's also one called Buddhify, which really, all of these have this kind of whitewashing or sort of sanitizing of Buddhist rhetoric. But the point is that they're all highly individualized. They're all really focused on wellness as just a way to pause before you go back to work, in the same way that Amazon had these like Amazon Zen booths or whatever they were called. So are there other mindfulness apps that fall outside of that highly individualistic framework? And so Catherine Knight Steele wrote a little bit about, I think it was Shine and Exhale are both apps, I think, created by Black women, or at least like for women of color, that are really, first of all, the other thing that the other apps do is that they're explicitly apolitical. They focus on turning inward, on, if you meditate enough, your problems will be gone, without sort of recognizing why those problems might exist. So I think it does kind of come back to that collective aspect again, because even if you're not physically in the same space as other people using some of these apps, there's still that feeling. And so that was something also with, Lisa Nakamura talking about Insight Timer, which is one of the few free meditation apps, which started out as very bare bones and really meant to connect with other Buddhists, to sit together. And then later on developed some of the more kind of bells and whistles, gamification aspects that Headspace has. So it's not like, these apps can only exist in this way, but the way they've been instrumentalized has been part of this kind of, rise and grind Silicon Valley culture. So I'm still sort of cynical about wellness. It's not really a word I use, but I think we were, again, trying to see if there was something redemptive in it.
All right, I am getting the signal to close here. Thank you all so much. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists and authors. Afterwards, I really want to talk to you all off panel about destroying AI maybe, or like, do we need AI for play? But we'll talk about that after. Charisse?
Yes, I was going to say, speaking of afterwards, so please stay. We still have 10 minutes. We're going to take a 10-minute break right now for everyone to go stretch, use the restroom, and there's also extra food in the back, so please take some more of that as well. After this, we're going to have a workshop facilitated by Jeff Nagy and Lisa Nakamura about AI and technoskepticism, so please stay for that conversation. Otherwise, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So if you want to head back to your seats, and I'll hand it off to Jeff and Lisa to get the conversation started.
I think I'm on. Am I on? I'm on. So there were a fair number of questions in the first part of this event, this launch, that were about AI, around AI, although we didn't talk about them that much in the preceding hour and a half, in part because we're going to talk about them explicitly now. And both of us, I think, are deeply interested in critical approaches to the AI world, or the AI hype, whichever perspective you take on it, that's kind of blooming all around us. And you're teaching a class on AI right now, as am I.
Yeah.
So we're both kind of thinking deeply about how to present these issues to students and sort of how to wrestle with them in an accessible format. I think that's been true for me. And we wanted to invite all of you who are still here with us, including those of you on Zoom, to do some of that thinking together in a workshop that we're going to sort of frame around some questions that we've been thinking about in the past months.
Yeah, so I wanted to remark that Jeff is the Associate Professor of Artificial Intelligence and Critical Data Studies at York University. So
I'm an assistant professor. I just got a promotion.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I'll take it, but I don't know what they'll say when I get back to York.
So clearly, they'll congratulate you. Clearly, an important person in the field and a good person to think with around these emergent questions. So we came up with these questions, I think, inspired somewhat by the book that we had written, which, as Lida said, was when AI, generative AI particularly, was much different than it is now. So we have some questions that speak to issues around difference, identity, some of the issues which are now somewhat illegal in this country, apparently, but we are going to do it anyway. I'm hoping they'll provoke some conversation so people can actually talk to each other, which is one of the reasons to get out of your house and come to anywhere. So should we, let's do the slides now maybe, okay?
Sure.
All right. So the first question we came up with is inspired by, wait, let me see it. Oh, okay. Is about the question of AI hallucination. What should we make of hallucinations of an inclusive history that never existed, such as Gemini's infamous woke AI images of Black Vikings, Asian popes, and indigenous founding fathers? So did people see these pictures at all? Is it DALL-E and other image generators?
It's Gemini, yeah. It was Gemini,
It
yeah.
was Gemini, right. So if you put in a prompt, it makes a picture based on the thing that you put in, and this is what was happening. But it doesn't happen anymore. So the question is, will we miss these absurd counter histories, or is it better that woke AI, quote unquote, is over almost as soon as it began?
Yeah, I can frame this a little more maybe. So when I was thinking about this, a lot of these companies have histories of being accused quite reasonably of bias, right, and discrimination. And so they sometimes take actions to try to prevent those scandals, probably not necessarily out of the goodness of their heart, but maybe sometimes, I don't know. And this was a case in which Gemini perhaps overcorrected, so that prompts requesting images of founding fathers would depict counterfactually diverse groups of founding fathers that included founding mothers and indigenous people who had been sort of deep dreamed to look like George Washington. It's really, so it sticks in your head. And this was kind of widely mocked at the time, but if we're in an era now where even the institutional imperative to engage in creating AI that is sensitive to diversity is perhaps receding, right? The way that DEI is going to be included in AI development efforts is probably going to look radically different over the next years. What should we sort of make of these counterfactually diverse AI productions?
Yeah, I think that speaks to the digital nostalgia question. Will we be nostalgic for this? So I think we can move on to the next question. Did you want to read this?
Sure. So this kind of comes out of some of the work that we did for this book, investigating whether or not AI can speak in Jamaican patois or AAVE or play the dozens. And so I'm a white guy. I'm from Kansas City. I have a kind of unmarked neutral accent. People usually can't tell where I'm from A lot of weather forecasters are from Kansas City because it kind of registers to a large percentage of Americans as being from no place. So I have sort of the voice of no place, the embodied voice of no place. And ChatGPT kind of sounds like me, you know? I'm just going to put that out there and just say that. It sounds a lot like me. It sounds perhaps like it's someone at a convention of weathermen from Omaha. Or perhaps a member of a curatorial committee who's writing a carefully voiceless wall text for a museum show, right? And that's kind of like its default. It defaults to me. And, you know, does it? No. Well, Rianna, I was thinking of you because during the last conversation, I actually asked ChatGPT to play the dozens with me, and it is significantly improved. And then I asked it, you know, what its opinion was of the Disco Network's claim that it could not play the dozens. And then it pointed out that we must be mistaken since I had been just emphatically roasted. So you gotta repeat replication is important in any science. But so for most people, this is not true, right? Most people are not speaking in unmarked, always grammatically correct, unplaceable English. And so can LLMs learn to talk like you? Or not? And is that desirable? Perhaps it's not desirable, right? So this is the second prompt, is to kind of think of a discourse community that you belong to, that's important to you, that is perhaps your home, to bring it back to nostalgia, and to sort of ask whether you can form that community with ChatGPT or with some other large language model, along any sort of vector of difference you want to consider. I guess I have a follow-up thought about this, which just occurred to me as I was thinking about teaching, and about the question in the past panel from Zoom, from P.F. Anderson, about AI and accessibility tech. So I teach at a large public university in Canada with a lot of international students for whom English is a second language. And many of them use ChatGPT not because they're not interested in learning, but because it actually facilitates that process for them and facilitates thinking in a language that is not their native language. So maybe that's even a kind of related thought to this. I had one student, this really stuck in my mind, who told me that she used ChatGPT so that she could participate in the classroom and framed her linguistic barrier in terms of communicating in English as explicitly as a disability. And in that relation, ChatGPT she thought of as a prosthetic technology, right, that gave her access to a discourse community that otherwise she might not be able to reach. So, you know, I'm open. I'm vacillating on the spectrum of possibility and refusal, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we did this experiment in the book around Black English and diasporic Black English, and it raises a question, like, could people learn better or differently if they were spoken to in their own regional languages? So if ChatGPT, you know, told me that something was hella convincing, I'm from the Bay Area, I'd be convinced, you know? Like, there's just a discourse around Bay Area slang and speech, which I would feel different if AI had stirred it up to me.
We're going to get hyphy AI?
That's a little after my time, but I'm impressed that you know it. Okay, so next question has to do with AI companies promising AI safety and AI ethics. So of course, we are critical and have our doubts. If this were the case, how is AI going to be made safe? For whom, and safe to what end? Artists like Beth Coleman, who's produced some of the images on our slides and the cover of the book, or Ian Cheng proposed making AI liberatory not by making it safe, but by making it wild and making it kin, framed as a kind of fugitive Black study, as Fred Moten writes, or praxis against AI white safety. How else might we see around the monolithic discourse of AI safety towards other relations? Would you want to add more? That was your question.
That was my question, yeah. Yeah, this one, so the slides you've been seeing all throughout the day, they come from a body of work created by a Toronto-based artist named Beth Coleman, who's connected to the Disco Network and whose work is on the cover of the book. And Beth kind of explicitly refuses any sort of engagement with AI safety. She's not interested in AI safety. She doesn't want to make AI safe. She wants to make it weird and make it wild. And she thinks that that is a potential pathway towards creating a future with AI that is liberatory. So for her, what that looks like, this is, I think, Atticus, you made these, right? So this is from a Beth Coleman series, probably called BPP.
Yeah, I took the cover and
Yeah. Yeah, so she makes these purpose-built GANs to generate images that are kind of wild. One of the series is a kind of like deep-dreamed Black Panther Party protest photo set. Another of them is all sort of based around Alice Coltrane. And the third is sort of based on Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy, I think. Yeah, so that's like a kind of concrete example of someone who's trying to do this, to try to kind of make AI kin. And I'm curious, what for all of us that might look like, what that kind of speculative future might involve.
Yeah, so the last question we had was also pulled out of the book and one of its central problematics. Are there ways that you are suspicious or skeptical of AI that have an origin in your own identity and its histories? Does it matter who introduces a new technology or how is it introduced to you? So this refers to a story that one of our authors wrote in the book about how his father, who he describes as a cranky elderly Black man, has never rejected new technologies, but has always rejected or objected to the ways they were presented to him. So this speaks back to the ways that, of course, Black people, people with disabilities, many people have had technologies that were not framed with them in mind and have in fact been exploitative or really, really harmful. And so, of course, people are skeptical, right? They haven't had great experiences. So do you think, just a kind of an internal exercise, do you think there's a way that you, in terms of your identity, race, gender, class, or whatever, feel towards AI that has its origin in that identity, right? So whatever that would be. And how does the way AI is introduced to you matter? Is it a family member? Is it school? Is it commercial? How does that help you like or not like it, or trust or not trust it? So those were our questions. Maybe people could get into groups somewhat based on which one they'd like to talk about, and we can come around and engage. And I think that Chad is going to do something similar.
And of course, like I can't see that founding fathers image and not like Hamilton, which is different from. I think maybe it should be a distinction from something like Bridgerton, but still, it's like, why is it different when it's AI? There is like a kind of are these similar things or are they not? Yeah. Sorry, well, how are you doing this? Yes. Right.
I really hope that 2-year-olds aren't watching Bridgerton. Okay.
Right. The promise of objectivity. That's like because you're not saying like, give me a fantastical image. You're saying give me an image of your father.
Yeah.
Right.
I think people can miss it. I don't know about I. What are we
So fascinating conversations about these questions, and I wish I could have been in all of them, but obviously none of us were. So I think it'd be great to hear back from groups what they talked about, and also from the chat, because we have not all been able to see the chat at all. So
Maybe let's start with the chat, the folks on Zoom, perhaps.
Actually, if you could do it in person first, because there's a lot of chats. Maybe we can select some chats that would be better than others.
yeah, would anybody like to start?
What about from this this table in the middle where I was sitting? I'll just put Rianna on the spot here.
Thanks. Hiya. So we were prompt 2, and we talked about quite a lot, but I think what we started with, that was the question about LLMs and voice, and about if we would feel better if it could sound like us and so on. And we were talking about, we talked about like training it to sound like us as well, like whether that was a good thing. We also talked about like the little uncanny valley thing, because Jeff revealed that he's got a bot that's been trained on some of his work and stuff. Well, not by him, not his.
I was approached by
There we
a
go.
company, I guess, who wanted to make an LLM trained on my scholarly output, and they did, and it exists. There is an AI version of me, but I find the idea of interacting with it in any way terrifying.
And I think he should, because it's the ultimate autoethnography.
I have simply refused to query AI Jeff. But you're welcome to.
I think so I want to do this now. I think that would be funny. But we were talking about like, well, a lot of the different like voice trainers, about whether you can make it sing like you, about whether it could code switch, could it, and then thinking about what we've talked about with remix and style and so on. So if it is trained on this corpus of information about you, can it produce new thought about things that you haven't spoken about previously based on all of the information that has been given before? And I want to see, and if that is like an idea of like co-production or new production, or what that means if that's happened. And yeah, we were just looking at like some of the different tools that can do, and talking to the ChatGPT voice output version, which Jeff had set automatically as a British guy.
I think I was demoing it for a class, and they were interested in the kind of like vocal identity based on accent that it could handle.
Yeah, it was pretty good. It sounded like a guy, like just a British guy. And then asking it again about playing the dozens, obviously it responded to like saying yes, I can play the dozens, but I was not happy about that, because we don't play the dozens in the UK. So I was like, what would we call it? But automatically I did start, that was like one of the first, I don't really listen to play with ChatGPT
But in that moment, you were policing the bounds of your own language community and refusing entrance to ChatGPT, who is presenting as a British man.
Yeah, but I did accept. I said we don't say that though, do we? What do we say? I instinctively started speaking to it like he was kin. So.
Well, that was actually the prompt.
He was definitely a white bread,
that was
though.
prompt 3.
I knew that.
So you were making kin with AI, which was not actually your task.
Yeah, sorry. I can't be contained. I'm wild, like in prompt 3.
I mean, I think the other thing from our conversation I'll bring up, we had a conversation about hallucination and the fact that AI does not hallucinate if we think about like lived experience of what hallucinating is. And so I think this is a way in which AI is often typified as having an experience and appropriating the experiences of a community in ways that actually don't reflect what it is that it's doing. So like hallucination is just used as shorthand for AI gets things wrong. So there's a way in which, again, I think that adoption of disability language to talk about what ills AI is what, it's frustrating, running out of words.
Should we move to one of the other tables? Or you were at the...
I was at a different table. I wasn't sure if we were going through the same question or different questions?
We can go to the other question. Yeah.
Okay, so I was at the table that talked about the woke AI and the founding fathers. And so right off the bat, when that question was brought up, I was sitting next to Huan and he went, Bridgerton. And so we talked actually a lot about colorblind casting, like a show like Bridgerton, or that's a sort of fantastic, I personally have not seen Bridgerton, but premise of it. But also Hamilton, for me, I couldn't see that image of the founding fathers of color and not think about Hamilton. But we talked about why is that different to have a theatrical production that is sort of conscientiously making a historical critique versus something that is presented as historically and factually correct when it's in fact wrong. Well, we also talked about, from a sort of media archaeology perspective, how this should be archived in some way and should be seen as a product of a particular historical moment, attempt to kind of correct bias, but then swinging so far in the opposite direction. And then we got into a more philosophical conversation about sort of the status of the image when text is the basis for it. There's this added layer of mediation that is different. So yeah, and then we talked about, we had some music people at the table, so we talked about musical notation and sort of started to think, it kind of like leaned a bit into the question 3 about AI, what would it look like for it to be wilder?
Well, we did have a group that was explicitly examining that question, so maybe we can ask them to share their thoughts next.
I guess I'll share for our group. I think we began by talking about the initial provocation about how do we make things wild, and beginning the question of, say, if AI is trying to represent a level of human cognition or human intelligence, shouldn't we embed it with mistakes? Inherently thinking about quantum computing, where the problem, the struggle is that it's making too many mistakes, and we are all frail and are chock full of mistakes, linguistically, textually, all different ways. And what does it mean to think about that as a way to move forward? But then we kind of started pushing these questions. I think part of the question was about safety as well, and pushing the similar concerns about safe for whom, and do we not want people to be able to print 3D print weapons? But I was telling people, I remember being able to download dot matrix printouts of how to make pipe bombs in high school. So
the Anarchist Cookbook, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So part of those questions is, well, we've all been playing in this world for time. So how do we reconfigure and reshape that experience? But then we kind of pushed it to level of creativity and just asking about what does it mean to be wild, and is that even possible within the way that AI is being configured and constructed right now? Is the idea of a feral AI where the large scale level of creativity would be open to expression and freedom, or is it just now about making very accurate summaries of your email and Zootoom chats? Is that's the driving force? And so how do we open up that to levels of creativity and expression? So I think there's some other thoughts.
I think we talked a little bit about the limits of generative AI of being wild, right? Could it be wild if it is trained on a subset of human information, data, right? To what extent could it become then wild? And is it worth the cost, right? The environmental costs, various other costs associated with it. And if we do develop wild AI, is that just a moving of the objective? Are we just trying to create, I was joking, I could imagine an industry of artisanal AI, right? Where people will just come out with AI with imperfections or these mistakes, right? That make it seem more human. But at the end of the day, isn't that still extraction and for the sake of capital? So I don't know. I don't know if I agree with, I don't know if I see the benefit of wild AI.
That's brilliant. It's like Jeff AI. That is, we don't know what
in the
it's
sense
gonna,
that it makes mistakes.
We don't know what it's going to do, right? But I think that substitution of wild for hallucination does something different, right? Because hallucination has an inevitable connection to the idea of pathology, you know, or unreality. But wild is a different thing. It means unaccountable, maybe, right? So results for which there is no explanation. Kind of fundamentally not possible in some ways with computers, but an interesting way to get at something else. So, yeah.
Should we move to our fourth prompt?
Let's see. So we started talking about, well, we talked about a number of things, but one of the things we talked about was certainty, that why does AI need to be so certain, and how that makes people sometimes interact with it, especially students. And Lauren brought up this, well, it's a platform, or it's a, can you tell the story?
About Notebook. Oh yeah, a bunch of my friends were like, aren't you just listening to the podcast for your readings? And I was like, what are you talking about? And there's like through Google Notebook LM is the program, and you just upload a PDF and then it generates a summary and you can ask questions, but then it also generates a podcast of two people talking and summarizing the content. So we were talking about a lot of the pros and cons to that. Does it make it more accessible? Are people getting a better understanding of the reading? But then also, what are you losing? Things like that.
And then we also played around with the idea of passing, and AI passing as truth or as expert, or, and then I was talking about, well, who's the dupe and who's being, who's the observer? And would you like to add a little more here?
No, we kind of took our conversation in many directions, but the reason why we got on this was actually in a direct response to the prompt, was that all of us, I think most of us, were introduced to AI in the classroom, and that was kind of our main introduction to like the impact of AI or the potential ramifications of AI, and how it potentially creates this like disciplinary relationship to just what AI can be and what it can do. And I think we were thinking about, you know, the anecdote that Jeff shared about passing, or not passing, or how we got on the topic of passing was like, you're a student who was a non-native English speaker who was using AI to participate and actually access, you know, a particular discourse community. And that got us to thinking about the kind of ways in which AI has kind of created a collective community of all of us trying to scrutinize and discern like what is actually AI and what's human expression, which, you know, this kind of notion of scrutinizing, there's a longer history of this practice that's also really racialized in terms of thinking about inscrutability. And all of these questions. So passing, we then went off on this riff about passing, and I learned about this schema that this scholar has about, you know, the act of passing actually involves like you need a dupe and someone who's the observer and the person passing. Yeah, and it was really fascinating. We talked a little bit about just different ways of thinking about what kind of knowledge is produced by AI. I think we've talked a lot about the classroom and like how AI functions in the classroom. I don't know how we got on this. I'm going to just transition awkwardly to one of the last things we talked about was like, we were talking about kind of pharmaceutical approaches and thinking about diagnoses and medicine, and then we were thinking about what the side effects of AI would be. Like, if we had like a prescription pill with like side effects, like what would the side effects of AI actually? The warning label, yeah. Anyway, just a little peek into our thoughts.
Yeah, I've thought about both of those things, AI and pedagogy and AI and diagnostics, quite a lot recently. I mean, AI and pedagogy, I still don't really know what I think about it, right? Maybe I'm stuck in this kind of waffling mode of scrutinizing trying to figure out what's actually going to happen, although I do acknowledge that for my students, and maybe it's particularly visible to me as someone who's teaching at a large public university in Canada with a lot of first-generation students, right? So it's particularly kind of resonant to me that they find like great utility in having access to these technologies. And I recognize that. I think that's great. But I kind of wonder at the same time, I've been thinking about this in terms of a scholar, Chris Cohen, has this, and maybe you know this one actually, this concept of the broken genre, which are media experiences that seem to invite conversation, they seem to invite relationality when in fact they foreclose it. And the example of this that he gives is like a recorded scam call. So, you know, there's that moment when well, no, I guess no one does this anymore because you just don't answer them, but I certainly used to. And you answer the phone and you know, you hear this voice that says like, hello, I'm calling about blah, blah. And you respond, or you have an urge immediately to respond in those microseconds before you realize that you've been had by a recorded voice. And that's this kind of example that he has for the ways that our technological environment, our media environment is increasingly saturated by these broken genres, these instances that seem to invite mutuality, but in fact foreclose its possibility. So I kind of wonder if ChatGPT is in a way making large parts of the pedagogical experience into a broken genre. So I assigned a final essay last semester, and I received some not very small percentage of final essays that had been very clearly generated by ChatGPT, which frustrated me. You know, I've sort of thought, like, why am I so frustrated by this, right? And you kind of have to do some like soul searching. What am I trying to protect here, exactly? When I kind of get up and get in a high dudgeon about this. But part of what I think it was that, you know, I sort of see the classroom and see these essays as like a relation, like an opportunity for some sort of mutuality. And ChatGPT breaks that. And that's much more frustrating to me than I think any idea of like plagiarism or whatever. I don't necessarily care so much about that, but it's the foreclosure of some sort of channel of communication and relation that I found like deeply sad in a way. And I have a lot of thoughts about AI diagnosis, but I have an article out about that in Just Tech, so if you're interested in what I think about that, you can check it out. Oh.
Yes, I was going to say a couple things the conversation talked about on Zoom was about the engagement on campuses to try to start their own AI, such as at U of M, Maisie, and a lot of distrust around that, and how IT on campus is making AI-powered tools, but they lack kind of pedagogical motivation and care for the digital accessibility about AI. So that was what a lot of the conversation centered around. It also talked about security risks with AI and things like that. But yeah, I think the main conversation is just about on specific campuses and engagement to try to get people to use AI that is generated by the university. So.
I think that's the end. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out. It was really fun to talk, and appreciate you being here to celebrate the book with us.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.